Do you feel the urge to move toward a more play-based practice and just don't know how to do it? Or maybe you're struggling to incorporate more child-led learning into your otherwise teacher-led program. The research is clear. Play is how children learn best during the early childhood years. But creating a classroom where play is the focus isn't always as straightforward as it may seem. I'm your host, Jen Zollinger. Join me as we explore the incredible ways that play serves preschool children and how to best implement it in your classroom. This is Play Before Pencils. I'm excited to have Simon Airey with me today. Simon has been teaching for 24 years across a variety of settings, including mainstream and specialist. The age groups that he has taught range between 2-year-olds and 9-year-olds. He has had a number of roles, including early years lead, maths lead, and computing lead. Simon is passionate about children's play, using these opportunities for learning based on the children's interests. He prides himself on facilitating an inclusive approach in his classes through movement, behavior support, and a neuro-affirming philosophy. Welcome to the podcast, Simon. I'm so happy to have you here with me.
Yeah, it's good to be here.
So today we're going to be talking about neurodivergent play, which I'm really excited about because of my background in special education. And I feel like neurodiversity is increasingly common, and it would probably be safe to say that if those people that are listening haven't had a child in one of their classes that is neurodiverse, that they will at some point. And so it's really important that we understand what it is, what it looks like, and have some knowledge in our toolbox so that we're able to provide those children with the best possible experience in our classrooms that we can. I think most, if not all of us, probably understand and know the term neurodivergent, but would you maybe just mind starting out by giving us a brief explanation of what neurodiversity is?
Well, my understanding of neurodiversity is people thinking that the brain is different, it's wired differently to a neurotypical brain, which we view as sort of typical development. And it could include children who either have been diagnosed or are awaiting diagnosis of autism, ADHD, but it's important to acknowledge there's other forms of neurodiversity such as dyslexia, dyspraxia, dyscalculia, and others as well. So it's a way of thinking and presenting differently, I would say.
Yeah, I'm glad actually that you addressed that neurodiversity can accompany a diagnosis, but it may not always accompany a diagnosis. And I think especially because we're talking about preschool age children in this podcast, a lot of those children don't have a diagnosis yet and may not receive one for a long time, if ever, and can still fall into the category of being neurodivergent. I think that's a pretty important thing to recognize. When I think back to the years that I taught special education preschool, we had a variety of different needs in my classes that affected the way that children played. And because of the training, the training that I had and the paraeducators in my classroom, we were prepared to support and meet those needs. But when we talk about settings where neurodiverse children are attending school alongside neurotypical children, the teachers, the staff in the classroom may not have very much training or background on how to navigate those different needs. So how can teachers ensure that their classroom environment is inclusive, it's supportive of children with a wide variety of neurodevelopmental needs?
I think key to that is before the children have even come into the setting, it's all the information gathering that you do on the child, any information you may have from the parents, caregivers. If the child is involved in any outside agencies, you have all that information there to hand. So you've almost got a snapshot of the child before they've come into the setting. But I think the key is it's transition. It's the child having experience of the setting before it starts. So in the past, I've had children in who are either emerging neurodivergent or have a diagnosis into the setting without anyone else there apart from myself and the caregiver, so that they can see what the environment looks like, and you can sort of see straight away if it's overwhelming for them in terms of the layout, what's in there, and also things like the color scheme of the room.
Yeah.
It's all those sort of, I'd call them more nuanced aspects of the child, and taking the lead from them about what they like and maybe what they don't like. And it's important then to acknowledge some children will communicate that through verbal means, but there'll also be neurodivergent children who are not yet verbal or non-speaking, and they choose to show their likes and dislikes in different ways. I think also within the classroom, it's making sure that the child's preferred communication style is followed. So, for example, a group that I'm working with at the moment, we have Visual Central. There's so many visuals that we have for things like emotions, I need, I want, and they're color coded. Some of them are non-color coded, and it's a lot of personalized learning. And I
Yeah.
appreciate that's difficult. That's difficult if you are teaching in a setting which isn't specialist, which here we would say it's mainstream,
Hmm.
with neurodivergent children within the setting. It's a difficult one to balance. But I think the key is you're taking the lead from the child.
Right. Yeah. I I feel like a lot of those things really even help to support neurotypical children. I think about just having a picture schedule. They like to know what their day holds for them. So being able to see that on a daily basis. And so when you recognize that, just a typically developing child benefits from that, a neurodivergent child benefits that much more by having some of those predictable things in place and understanding some systems in the classroom that are specifically there to support them. I always encourage my parents that are looking to sign up for my program to come in and meet me. I think it's important to know that I'm a good fit with them, for their child, all of those things. So often parents don't do that. And I really feel like I do miss out on that information gathering aspect prior to school even starting so that I can go in prepared, and that transition is so much smoother when we're able to do that beforehand. So, when we're talking about play, children who are neurodivergent often really struggle with social interaction. It's not as natural for them to engage in social interactions with their peers. And I've seen this a lot in my classrooms as I've had children who are neurodivergent. They express that in very different ways. I think maybe that's an important thing to recognize, is that neurodiversity is not a specific set of parameters. It looks very different from person to person. And so just taking that time to be able to observe a child and see how they interact, where their strengths and weaknesses are, is really helpful. But do you have any specific strategies that you use to encourage some peer interaction and some positive social experiences for neurodivergent children while they're playing?
The most successful experiences that have happened are, when we look at images sort of on Pinterest and the, social media, we get these sort of images of, I'm going to call it pristinely set up
Yes.
things,
Yeah.
such as like we call them tough trays, where
Hmm.
everything's sort of set up
Right.
for the children. These things are set up for the children, and actually, the most meaningful play for the children is the things that you've provided the things for them, but you've got the blank canvas for the children to be able to express themselves. So I find that the children who particularly are neurodivergent will come into the setting and they'll already know what they want to go for or what they want to do, whether it's walking around and having a look at what's there or engaging in something which they're particularly interested in. So it might be block play, it might be water play, sand tray, um, home corner. And I think it's important that we, as practitioners, we facilitate those special interests through what we provide, what we offer the children. And sometimes, particularly from the sort of social interaction viewpoint, I think that if we want neurodivergent children to interact socially, is what's the aim? because
Yeah.
if we want children to behave, if we want neurodivergent children to be having targets of interacting socially with other children, doesn't that indicate to us that we're trying to make them neurotypical rather than
Hmm.
celebrating
Right.
who they are? Because sometimes we have this sort of neurotypical idea that play has to be, it starts off on your own, then you parallel play, then you're gradually building up to playing with other children, when actually I think there's value in, if a child, and I actually, as an adult, I work better on my own than with other people, even though I recognize that there are some things we need to do within our job which
Yeah.
requires working with other people. But it's allowing children that space to take what we've provided for them. And it's almost as if with adults, we need to get away from, okay, well, this box is for doing this thing is for doing this, when actually our neurodivergent children will come up with the most amazing and very interesting ways of using resources that we've provided. So I suppose to answer your question, it's the more open-ended the resources are we provide for the children, the more in depth or the more focus, the greater length of time we're going to have, or we're going to be observing the children using them. So things like boxes is a winner for me every time. The
Yeah.
more and other sorts of, I'll go to like the charity shops or like car boot sales, and you're never quite sure what you're going to find, but you'll see something, you think, yeah, that looks good. I'll try that out and see what happens. So there's definitely a lot there that we can do for our neurodivergent children, but it's us having the confidence to almost let them start off by themselves so that we can see what it is that they do with what we provide for them.
Yeah. There are so many things that I want to unpack within that you just shared. I think number one, I love that you brought up the fact that all too often we try to mold neurodivergent people to our neurotypical world. We want them to fit into that world rather than us trying to embrace and cross over into their world a little bit. I've worked in programs that recognize children with neurodiversity, and instead of figuring out how we're going to work within that piece of them, we implement behavior charts or programs to help them fit the classroom that we envision we should have. And that's such a loss for everybody, I feel, when we do that. So I think just recognizing that and maybe trying a little bit harder to, not have them conform to our world. Another thing that I picked up on was, you talked about the stages of play. I can think of a student that I have who spends a big chunk of his playtime, his free playtime every day, just observing. And initially at the beginning of that school year, I was trying to like, okay, what are you interested in? Where do you want it? Do you want it? I'm introducing him to all of the different things within the classroom that might pull him in. And when I stopped and just took a step back, I could see that he's observing what's happening in the classroom so that he can kind of figure out, where do I fit into that? Where is a safe place in the classroom? If I want to play by myself, then I need to know where the other kids are drawn to, or what's happening that might interest me that I might choose to enter that play. And giving him the space to do that was life-changing, because all of a sudden I did start to see his point of development that he was at was really starting to shine forth. And it was okay to let him play, to be able to recognize that for him, observation is a form of play. And then once he's comfortable with that, he can break into, engaging with materials or trying to enter play with a peer. And so that was really, really a cool experience for me to be able to recognize that I just need to let his things happen. He can figure that out, and I'm here to support if he needs help and expresses that in various ways. But giving him the space to kind of do that on his own was really important for him.
I think that's a lovely example of, it's almost a mixture of child-led learning but the role of the adult's crucial in terms of, if you had interfered in that sort of observation play, then you may have got a different outcome, as it
Yeah.
were. And I think that, stepping back and looking at what the children are doing with their play is one of the most beneficial things that we can do for ourselves and for the children that are in our care. And there's a brilliant book called A Guide to Send in the Early Years by Kerry Murphy, who's a
Mm,
brilliant
I'll have to look that up.
advocate of neurodivergent play, and she talks about sort of types of play pattern that maybe we see, but we don't often sort of say it out loud. Things like, apart from things like lining things up, which is commonly assumed to be an
Right.
autistic way of playing, when actually neurotypical children also line
All the
things
time.
up as
All
well.
the time. Yeah.
But things like, as well, sometimes children will say, I'm just thinking of an example, like a child going up a slide and they go down the slide, they might say again, again, again. And that's their form of play. They want to do the same thing over and over again.
Right.
And they might do it the same way, they might make a subtle change to it. And it's a fascinating thing to watch children and their play, and is almost going in with it without any preconceptions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I kind of want to shift just a little bit to maybe how to support neurotypical children in their engagement with their neurodiverse peers, because I think for the most part, my experience has been that children don't really notice the same way that adults do when somebody does something differently than they do. It's almost like, hey, that's cool. I want to try that too. But as my preschoolers start to kind of get to that little bit, 5 years old, getting ready to move out of the pre-K stage and into the kindergarten stage, sometimes they start to notice, communication differences that their neurodiverse peers might have, or, just that the way that they're able to engage is a little different. And it's always a little heartbreaking for me when they reach that point and start noticing and maybe pull away from a friendship with that peer, because there's just so much to be gained from that. How do you support and encourage neurotypical students in continuing to cultivate those relationships with their peers who are neurodivergent?
I think we're very fortunate now to have recently a range of children's books which highlight these qualities in other children. And, reading stories to children about some who may have sensory processing difficulties, or children who see the world differently, it provides a very powerful viewpoint and a lens to see that there are differences there. And I suppose it comes under the umbrella of being inclusive.
Yeah.
And when I think of it being inclusive, I take inclusivity to go beyond neurodiversity, to go into sort of race, to go into gender, to go into all those stereotypes which, our very youngest children will say these things. They'll say things like, oh, they might notice that a child in group time may be sitting on a chair with like a gym band on their chair to give them some proprioceptive inputs and movement while they're doing story time. But that's inclusive. That's being inclusive, and I think it's what the adult does about it. So if the adult acknowledges it and then they're including it within their discussion, I think it sends a very powerful message to our children that everyone's valued with what they bring with what they bring to the setting.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. I'm going to bounce back just a little bit because I remembered something else that you mentioned earlier, and that is sensory needs of neurodiverse children. You brought up a tough tray, and I've got a tough tray in my classroom that I use for a lot of sensory experiences. But I'm also thinking about, light and noise, just the overall environment and how that affects all of the students in my classroom. And I have at times had children who just really struggle with like, and you know what, I can relate to this, chaos. I don't like chaos. And some people might say I'm in the wrong profession if I don't like noise and chaos, because that's kind of what young children are all about is, during their exploration, it can get a little noisy. I've had students who that really sets them off. And so trying to find a balance between providing all of the things developmentally that all of the children need, and also acknowledging some of the limitations, maybe sensory wise, of my neurodivergent students. How have you found a way to balance those two things so that it kind of comes into an equilibrium between those without being detrimental to one or the other?
Yeah, it's a difficult one because we're constantly presented with with quite an overwhelming sensory environment,
Yeah.
and depending on which sense it is, because I'm thinking that because I've got a child who, even in a group of four, they will request ear defenders
Mm,
because the conversation that's happening clearly is too much
too
for them. It's
much.
too overwhelming
Yeah.
for them. But with the ear defenders on, they feel much better because of it. And yeah, it's striking a balance between, well, whichever sense is being overwhelmed, or which senses are being overwhelmed, what can we do to either make it more comfortable for that child? And it's almost you think in the moment,
Yeah.
and if it's visual overload, then my strategy has always been to take them outside. I think there's a lot to be said about an outside space, regardless of whether it's like a field or whether it's the playground or whatever. I think there's a lot of evidence to back up that being outside does a lot to alleviate sensory overload.
Yeah. It's very grounding.
Yeah, I think also if you look at all the other senses, it's almost, yeah, you've got to try and establish what it is first of all, because the child may not be able to communicate what it is that's
Yeah.
upsetting them. So where the visuals come in is key. I have a little chart that says it is on it, and then it's got a picture of like too loud, too smelly, too noisy, etc. And the child will pick one and stick it on the chart, and then there's a couple of options that we go for if it's whatever they've put on there. But that takes a lot of thinking in the moment, and it's almost you're building up a sensory profile for
Yeah.
that child, because once they've expressed it and you found something that works, then that should always be there.
That comes back to probably to some of that information gathering that you referenced earlier. Parent being able to say lots of noise or, too much visual stimulation, those kinds of things, knowing that ahead of time that that child may struggle with those things, and maybe even knowing what some of those cues are. I know that sometimes
Mhm.
I will even, in order to not single out a child and say, oh, it's too loud in here for Johnny, I might say, oh, it's hurting my ears when you talk that loud, and kind of putting it on myself to lower that noise level or something, just because I know that if Johnny's having a hard time with it, another child might be having a hard time with it. I actually
Mhm.
might be having a hard time with it. And so being able to take a little bit of that responsibility off of them and just recognizing some of those cues to be able to meet those needs when they arise.
It's finding out what's the best way to help a child regulate, because the young children that we work with, they're developing at a phenomenal rate. But the one thing that they need is for the adult to be in their court,
Yeah.
the adult to be co-regulating with them, and knowing what possible co-regulation strategies you could implement in order to make not just the neurodivergent children but all children to feel comfortable. Because you may get a child who may quite on an everyday basis, they might be absolutely fine in group time, but there might be one day where they may have come in with something that's happened outside of school, and they may think. I mean, I sort of normalize things like using like little I call them sensory tools, and I have them. I have them myself because I need them
Yeah.
sometimes, and I mean I've been using them sort of for the past year on and off, but I find using them you've got to do a really good solid introduction to how they use first of all, because
Yes.
without any explanation it could turn into,
A
quite
bit of
frankly,
a
like a
free for all,
circus,
right? Yeah.
free for all. Once I think with very young children, once you show them that this helps you if you're moving it like this in a sort of like a routine like way, it helps you. And then for some children who just need to keep their hands busy whilst they're listening to the input that the practitioner is giving, I think these things are really useful. And I think there's such a lot of these sort of things out there
Yeah.
at the moment now. It's just finding the ones that best fit the children in your care.
Yeah. It's interesting when you bring those up. Instruction is really important, like you said, because it can, go from 0 to 10 in no time flat if the kids don't know how to use those. And I also think, something that I've experienced is when you maybe give a child who needs a fidget or a sensory, input toy during group time, everybody wants one. And for me, that's okay. I don't mind, when you have that instruction ahead of time. Sometimes it's just like giving everybody the opportunity. And then over time, the children who don't need that as much kind of, the novelty wears off and they move on and they're okay if their friend has it, but they don't. And so that can be a really, really helpful tool when it's used the right way. I like that suggestion a lot. Another question that I have is when you're setting up your play environment, we talk about, I'm like you, I love just open-ended play. We do have some influence over that because we are choosing a lot of the materials and kind of providing them within the classroom and then allowing the children to come in and see what they do with that. Do you ever have to step in and make adaptations as you notice that maybe the way that a child is interacting with a material is maybe not quite appropriate for the setting?
Yeah, daily basis that has to happen on. Yeah, I've even thinking ahead to this week. The stuff that I've got in my mind that will form the basis of the provision for the week. I already pretty much suspect that within the first half an hour, it will change in
Yeah.
terms of either I'll need to add something or change something or alter something, because you're never quite sure. With all the best will in the world, you don't know what the kids are going to do
Yeah. Yeah.
with it.
It's true.
And I suppose things that are sort of, as long as things are, accessible to the children, they're in labeled boxes or trays or however you choose to organize your classroom. If the children know that they can take what they need and do what they want with it in for their play, I think that's a really good thing. But on the other hand, there are times where you've collected lots of observational evidence of what the children are interested in, and you think, all right, I'm going to set up this wonderful activity for the children to access, and then within 5 minutes it's trashed. It's
Yeah.
absolutely trashed because they've decided to do something else
Yeah.
with it. So it's almost a balancing act between, free play plus sort of the enhancements that you provide for the children, and where you go from there. Because I think with the one thing I've learned about working with early years children, you just go with it. You go with whatever it.
Yeah.
You have to go with whatever it
Got to be
is,
flexible,
because they'll
right?
tell you. They'll tell you.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, I have just one last question. I wondered if you maybe had any success stories or like really positive outcomes. It seems, you take a really measured approach to working with neurodiverse children. And do you have any stories that you can share with us where things have just really gone right and it's been something to celebrate?
I suppose one of my, I'd say, more recent successes is that because I'm a visiting teacher, I visit lots of different schools, so I don't have one permanent school at the moment. So one of my most enjoyable bits of my recent career is that I did work in an alternate provision for children with autism, plus some of them had additional diagnosis or dual diagnosis as well. And a lot, these children were older than early years children. So we're talking 7, 8, 9 year olds.
Okay.
And what I found rewarding is that a lot of the things that you consider early years approach works with those children. And I don't know if it's because of what it was or how it's presented to the children, but it was very much open-ended things. It was very much, the support was there in terms of like a visual, like colors, numbers and shapes, in terms of sort of formulating sentences, but the whole sort of experience of that, of seeing those children access the learning through what's provided for them, is almost a culmination of things I'd done beforehand, and seeing it in practice in a total alternate provision was very, very rewarding. And I can see now that sort of bits of that I now take elsewhere with me, I think has proven to be very, very valuable. And just to see progress of children in the time that I work with them, because they often come to me, you have to do all that sort of connection building, relationship building right at the start.
Yeah.
And then to see it progress to such a point where there's comfort there for the children, which also that's not always measured in data or scores or whatever, but for me that's if not more significant than all of that, that you know that you've made an impact on these children.
Absolutely. That's beautiful. As we wrap up, do you have any favorite resources that people can access for learning more about neurodivergent children and play specific to that, or even just play in general? And where can we find you?
In terms of neurodivergent play, the book that I mentioned earlier, I've got it here somewhere. It's called A Guide to Send in the Early Years by Kerry Murphy. This is a brilliant book. And she's also done a beginner's guide to neurodivergent play, which I know that you can find through, there's a website called Tapestry, who do lots of little handouts on different areas of the early years provision. And she's done one on self-directed neurodivergent play. So a lot of inspiration I take from that. In terms of finding me, I have Instagram account. That's the best place to find me. It's at Simon Inclusion Teacher, which has a mixture of carousels with information on some lovely memes in there, which highlight the struggles and successes of working with neurodivergent children. So lots of information on there.
Simon has a great page. Go follow him there and get some good information, as well as a little bit of entertainment with some of his memes and comics that he posts. So Simon, thank you so much. I learned a lot today. I'm going to have a lot of things to take back to my classroom that I can use to implement and better support the children in my classes who are neurodivergent and neurotypical, to make our classroom environment just a happy and safe place for all of the children that are there. So I appreciate your time today. Thanks for chatting.
Pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks again for listening. Remember to hit that subscribe button to continue learning how to bring more play into your classroom. Plus, get more tips on Instagram at play_before_pencils or at playbeforepencils.com.